sending people to one of them? Sorry about that, but people are going to be confused.
If they contact me, I can get them in there. Yes.
Okay, I'll go to the presentation one. Sorry about that.
So Paul, I think most people have been going to the one that's named for the presentation.
Okay.
So aim for X reading what's new and what's coming. And if we see people in the other one, we'll dump them in the recent presentation name. That's what other people have been doing.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right, our next session is being led by Hongli Fan, and the title is Extensive Reading in French, an Experiment. And as I mentioned, this is a recorded session, and we'll turn it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Greg. I want to first thank everybody for coming to my presentation. I know it's late in Japan and you've all had a long day. So I really appreciate everybody coming to this talk. Okay, so I want to first introduce myself. So I'm from China and I work in the United States for 22 years and also speak French. So Chinese, English, and French are the languages that I'm very interested in. And I'm also very interested in extensive reading. I think it is a fantastic method that is severely underutilized in classrooms. So I did a little experiment and I'm going to tell you about it. And I will try to be concise so that I can finish in the allotted time, which is 20 minutes. So let's go. Okay. All right. So the study is inspired by the book flood studies. And I think if you're in this conference, I bet you know about the book flood studies, but I'll go over it very briefly. And especially to show you that the conditions in the book flood studies are very similar to study a foreign language in the US. The book flood studies were introduced to a lot of countries because of the following conditions that I listed on the slide. So first one is there is insufficient exposure to English. And I want you to think about learning a foreign language in the US. Say if you're learning French in the US, there is this insufficient exposure to French. Maybe less exposure than in the book flood studies, because in the book flood studies, the students were going to school in English. The language of instruction was English. Versus here, the language of instruction is the student's first language. So second, there isn't a lot of motivation among students. And think about learning French in the United States. Students really do not have a lot of motivation. I would say maybe less motivation than in the book flood studies. So number three, the condition is the teaching material was not very effective because the method used at that time was the audiolingual method. But I think that nowadays with a textbook, if you just follow the textbook, I wouldn't call it a very effective teaching method. The last one is teachers are teaching in their second language. So the students, the teachers who are teaching French in middle schools and high schools, most of them are teaching in their second language. So they're not necessarily confident in their proficiency level. So I would say that even though the book flood studies were done, in developing countries where English was the language of instruction, I see a lot of similarities between those countries and learning a foreign language in the US. And that's why I wanted to see if using extensive reading would work in the United States. Okay. All right. And as you know, in the book flood studies, about 100 books per year were read by the teacher and explained to the students. So the students were using stories instead of a textbook. And as I think you all know, the book flood studies found that they were able to double the rate of reading acquisition with about 100 high interest books. And so I was trying to see if using books in the high school and middle school classrooms would have the same impact. Okay. And I think it's important to take a look at the pedagogical implications of the book flood studies and see how they could apply to learning a foreign language in the US. As the first pedagogical implication is time spent on reading in school is not entertainment. It must be seen as educationally beneficial, which means that when students are reading high interest books, it's not, it cannot be seen as supplementary. It should be seen as learning a language, especially if that book is in a foreign language. It is language learning. It's not something you do after class if you have time. The second pedagogical implication that I think is very, very important is we don't have to strictly control the vocabulary and structures. I know there it is beneficial and we should control students the vocabulary and grammatical structures used in the reading material. For example, as you are involved in extensive reading, we know that you should give students something that is at I-1 level. But a strict control over the vocabulary and the structures may not be necessary. It is important for students to figure out the meaning, and that is more useful than learning vocabulary list, for example. So before I talk about my study and the specific participants and the procedures, I would like to talk about my son's experience because I kind of did an experiment on my son. And not that he volunteered, but when he was in 7th grade, he started learning French. And at that time, he knew nothing, practically nothing in French. But I started reading with him about a couple times per week. And I remember we were reading children's books at the beginning, and then we moved on in the next year to chapter books. And we did it for about 3 years. And of course, when we're on vacation or when he's not in the mood or when there's a break, we don't read. So we didn't do it very diligently. But over the 3 years, he was able to read chapter books very quickly and with a very good understanding. And at the end of the 3rd year, he signed up for a French AP exam in the US. And he got a 4 out of 5, which means that he could skip 2 years of college French if he were continue to do it in college. And in terms of the European framework, I would say it's about the B1 level, somewhere around that. So I think that was pretty successful, I would say, considering the amount of work that was put in. So I wanted to duplicate that among my students. Not my students, but I'm teaching in college, but I was thinking if maybe I could do that with middle school students. And I want to point out that when I was reading with my son, he would read out loud and he would explain to me what he was reading in English. It's basically just translation. So he would read it out loud in French and then translate everything. So it was not a very sophisticated way of doing things, but it was quick. And we did no speaking, no writing, no listening. And if you know something about the AP exam in the US, you know that there is listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And he practically had no practice except in reading. And if he got a score of 4, I think that shows how powerful just reading is. All right, so the participants in my study were in junior high school, and they were 8th grade students, about 14 years old. And they have studied French for 2 years in 6th grade and 7th grade. I need to point out that when they were studying in 6th grade, they did not, it was an exploratory class, which means that they were just having fun. They had a French class, they had a Spanish class, they were trying to decide which one they were going to pick. So they had a French class 1 day per week. And then in 7th grade, when they decided to learn French, they had French every single day, 5 days a week for about 35 minutes per day. Okay. And to give you an idea of how much they cover, if you take 7th and 8th grade French combined, it's about 1 semester of college French. So it's about French 101 level, which is very basic. Okay. And the students, they all had English as their first language, except for 2 students. One is bilingual English Chinese, another is bilingual English Korean. All right, we did it via Zoom because it was during the pandemic, and it was just easier to set it up through Zoom instead of going through all the paperwork. And we did it twice a week after school. It was only possible to do it after school because I didn't want to take up the time, for high school French teachers, and they were not really convinced for me to come in and take their classroom time. So basically, students read children's books in French with my guidance. They would what they did was they read the sentences out loud. I would correct their pronunciation. We would go page by page. I make sure they understand what the page says before we move on to the next one. And we did it throughout about 3 months. We did about 18 sessions total, 40 minutes each, which is the maximum amount of time allowed through Zoom. All right, to give you an idea of what material we used, I found all my material, all my books on YouTube. And this is an example of a book. As you can see, it is a children's book. It has lots of pictures. And for one page, there's about one line, maximum 2 lines. And the average number of words in each book is about 100. Okay, so it's very short, very simple storyline. And I found on YouTube a series of books designed for French kids who are learning to read, who are in kindergarten, for example, and they're just trying to read. So those are very easy books, the easiest that I could find. I wanted something with a storyline, not just a word or a list of words. So I did a pre-study questionnaire, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the results and compare it with post-study questionnaire. And I also did a pre-study vocabulary test. I gave them the 100 most common French words, and on average, they know about 30% of the first 50 words and 18% of the second 50 words. So it's not a very good level. And it seems that they forgot a lot of things that they actually learned, because the teacher told me they should have known this, they should have known that, but most of the students, for some reason, didn't. All right, so in terms of results, I'm just gonna tell you briefly about what's changed. So for reading in French is easy for me. It changed from on a scale of 1 to 10, from 3 to 6. So I think that students are having more confidence in themselves to read in French. Next one is, I don't think I know enough words in French to read. It went from 8 to 3, meaning that students believe that now they are able to, they know words, they can read stories. And number 5 says, I don't think I'm ready to read stories in French at the beginning before they had any experience. It was 1, meaning that they strongly think that they were not ready. And now it's 9 because they had experience reading stories. Now they are definitely more confident. They think they're ready. And the last one is, I would like to read the French stories every day. It went from 2 to 8, meaning that they didn't want to do it. They, even though they didn't know what it would be involved, what would be involved in it, they didn't want to do it. And now it's 8 out of 10, meaning I would think that they are interested and they're curious, they're willing to do it. All right, in terms of vocabulary, so they know more words now. They don't have a spectacular improvement, but I was not looking for a spectacular improvement. It went from 15 words to 20 words for the first 50 words. And for the second 50, half of the 100 words, they went from 9 words to 15 words. So there definitely is improvement. And I also picked 30 words from the 5 books that we read. And students recognized the meaning of about half of the words, which I would say is pretty good. All right, so of course there were a lot of problems, and the pronunciation was a big problem. I did not expect pronunciation to be that big of an issue, because basically I had to correct students' pronunciation word by word and student by student, because basically what they did was they would look at the word and pronounce it in the way they would pronounce an English word, which is totally wrong. And French people would not be able to understand them. And that is not their teacher's fault because their teacher speaks very good French. But I guess with a lot of students, if they don't have individual attention, they don't know how to pronounce a word, they would just revert into English. They will use their first language and just guess. For example, the French R is very different from the English R. And at the beginning, almost everybody was pronouncing the French R with the English R. So I did a lot of corrections with the students. Most of our time, I would say, we spend most of our time working on pronunciation to make sure that they're saying the words correctly. So that took a lot of time, and that was part of the reason why we did not finish a lot of books. And we did a lot of rereading. Whenever we start a new book, we would review the old book. And I could see that the second time the students were reading the book, it was a lot faster and a lot more accurate. So it did take a long time, but I think storybooks are a good choice for beginning French learners because there are words that are used very frequently, and there is a coherent discourse instead of word lists. So I think we should continue using it, if not in our classrooms, at least as something outside of the classroom. If I were in charge of the school curriculum, I might just use the storybooks, but I'm not. So that's my presentation, and I put my email address over there in case you have more questions. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup pour la présentation.